Imagine a man so politically sharp he could build a party from the ruins of another. A man who operated not from the battlefield but from backrooms and ballots. Long before Lincoln or Roosevelt, there was one political mastermind who shaped the Democratic Party we know today. This is the gripping story of Martin Van Buren, the sly fox of Kinderhook, the founder of modern American politics, and the 8th President of the United States. Part 1. The Rise from Humble Roots. Born in 1782 in Kinderhook, New York, Martin Van Buren wasn't like the grand, landed gentry who often graced American politics. He was the son of a tavern keeper, raised among Dutch-speaking locals, and steeped in the language of the common man, both literally and politically. His father's doubled as a political hub where revolutionaries, farmers, and tradesmen mingled. This environment lit the first flame of political curiosity in young Martin. By the time he was 14, Van Buren was already working as a law clerk. Sharp-minded and unusually ambitious, he quickly grasped the political landscape, a world ruled by family dynasties and regional aristocracy. But Van Buren saw a different path. He would rise not through name or fortune, but through organization, alliances, and strategy. Part 2. Master of Political Machines. As a young lawyer, Van Buren wasn't content with merely practicing law. He saw that American politics was fractured, chaotic parties, unsteady coalitions, and fading revolutionary fervor. He entered the New York Senate and became the leader of a faction known as the Bucktails, a populist, anti-elitist wing of the Democratic Republican Party. But Van Buren's true genius emerged when he built a political machine, the Albany Regency. The Regency was the model of political discipline. Van Buren understood that democracy wasn't just about votes, it was about controlling the people who controlled the votes. He recruited loyal men, placed them in key government posts, and demanded strict party unity. This machine ran New York politics like clockwork. He was not a fiery speaker or a war hero, but a behind-the-scenes strategist, a political technician. Think of him as the first true party boss in American history. Part 3. Crafting the Democratic Party. As national politics began to fracture after the collapse of the Federalist Party, Van Buren saw an opportunity. The old order was dying, it needed to be replaced, not reformed. Van Buren believed in building a party that spoke to the farmer, the laborer, and the immigrant, not just the elite. He forged a powerful alliance with Andrew Jackson, a war hero with enormous popular appeal. But Jackson lacked political organization. Van Buren would supply that. Together they created a formidable duo, Jackson's charisma and Van Buren's discipline. Van Buren rallied state leaders, newspapers, and activists into a coherent national machine, one that would become the Democratic Party. It was grassroots. It was tightly organized. It was a revolution in American politics. He called it the principle of organized political opposition, that without a structured party system, democracy would collapse into chaos. It was a radical idea for the time. But Van Buren saw farther than most. Part 4. The Presidency and the Panic. In 1836, after serving as Jackson's loyal vice president, Van Buren rose to the highest office in the land. But the timing was cruel. Just months into his term, the country plunged into the Panic of 1837, a catastrophic financial crisis. Banks failed, unemployment soared, and the public cried for government intervention. But Van Buren, a believer in limited federal power, refused to bail out the banks. He thought the market should correct itself. This stance made him enemies, fast. His polished style and refined demeanor, once admired, now seemed out of touch. The man who had built the strongest political party in the land was suddenly powerless in the face of economic collapse. His presidency became a crucible. He was mocked as Martin Van Buren. Yet through the fire, Van Buren stood firm in his principles, a believer in small government, in states' rights, and in the slow, deliberate pace of democracy. Part 5. The Free Soil Revolt, a rebel against his own creation. As the 1840s marched on, the issue of slavery began to tear at the seams of American politics. Van Buren, though no abolitionist, had always walked a tightrope on the matter. While he upheld Southern property rights during his presidency, his personal views began to evolve. He saw the growing expansion of slavery into new Western territories as a threat to national unity and democracy itself. By 1848, Van Buren had become disillusioned with the Democrats, the very party he had built. The Southern wing of the party now held increasing control, pushing aggressively for the expansion of slavery westward. Van Buren could not stand by. In an act that shocked the political world, he joined a new political movement, the Free Soil Party, a radical coalition of anti-slavery Democrats, disaffected Whigs, and abolitionists. At age 65, Van Buren ran once more for the presidency, but this time not to win but to send a message. His platform was simple yet revolutionary: free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. He declared that slavery must not expand to the Western territories. He knew his candidacy would divide the Democrats, and it did. In fact, his presence handed the presidency to Whig candidate Zachary Taylor, but Van Buren didn't regret it. He had drawn a clear moral line in the sand. Part 6. Legacy of a Political Architect. Martin Van Buren would never again hold office, but his legacy was far from over. The Democratic Party he helped build would continue, torn by factions and evolving through the Civil War and Reconstruction. Yet the fundamental idea he championed, that organized, disciplined political parties were essential to democracy, remains embedded in the American political system to this day. He showed that power doesn't always wear a crown or a uniform. Sometimes, it whispers in meetings, in strategy memos, in coalition building, and shapes nations without firing a shot. He was a president, yes, but more than that, Van Buren was an architect. Of political machinery. Of party loyalty. Of the concept that politics could and should be built from the ground up. Though often overshadowed by louder figures like Andrew Jackson or Abraham Lincoln, Van Buren's brilliance lay in quiet mastery, the art of shaping public will through structure, not spectacle. In his later years he retired to his Kinderhook estate, Lindenwold, where he penned reflections on politics, watched the nation drift toward war, and died in 1862, a year into the Civil War he had tried in his own way to prevent. Part 7. Van Buren's Impact on Modern American Politics. Martin Van Buren may have left the political stage in the 1860s, but his ideas echoed through the decades that followed, and still reverberate in today's political playbook. He was the first to fully understand that political power was not about charisma alone, but about organization, networks, loyalty, and message control. His concept of the political party as a living, breathing machine would become the blueprint for modern campaigning. From the local precincts to the national stage, Van Buren's legacy can be seen in the rise of political operatives and strategists, who, like Van Buren, work behind the scenes to manage campaigns, frame narratives, and construct electoral coalitions. The use of state and local infrastructure to maintain party loyalty, from party conventions to get out the vote drives. Message discipline, which Van Buren insisted on through the Albany Regency, a practice now common among both Democratic and Republican leadership. He was among the first to understand that ideology alone cannot sustain a political movement. It needed mechanisms: newspapers, public speaking circuits, fundraising systems, and loyalists in key offices. He understood that democracy is fragile, and in order to prevent it from devolving into chaos, it had to be channeled. In fact, modern American partisanship, both its strengths and its divisions, finds some of its DNA in Van Buren's vision. He wanted structured opposition because he believed that two strong parties would prevent tyranny and create accountability. That principle still underpins the two-party system today. Part 8. A president for the people, not of the elites. Van Buren's legacy is paradoxical. He was a man of the people yet deeply strategic. He was a political insider, but he came from humble beginnings. He built a party for common citizens, yet did so through elite-level maneuvering and masterful control. Unlike many founding fathers, Van Buren wasn't born into the mythology of America's birth. He came afterward, a child of the Republic, not the Revolution. That gave him a different perspective. He saw that systems outlast heroes, and that democratic institutions need caretakers, not just visionaries. He became that caretaker, designing a durable political engine that could operate beyond any one man's charisma. Even his defeat in 1840, at the hands of a populist wave fueled by slogans and spectacle, revealed how quickly American politics was changing. But Van Buren knew that even if he lost the presidency, he had already won a greater victory. He had built something that would last. Part 9. The Unseen Thread in America's Political Tapestry. Walk through the corridors of modern American politics, and you'll see Van Buren's shadow. Campaign managers. Party platforms. National conventions. Coordinated messaging. Voter databases. Swing state strategies. These all owe something to the little man from Kinderhook. Even presidents who would seem to have nothing in common with him, from Franklin D. Roosevelt to Barack Obama, relied on the party infrastructure and organizing ethos Van Buren set in motion nearly 2 centuries ago. Though he is rarely memorialized in grand statues or blockbuster biographies, Van Buren remains one of the most consequential political minds in U.S. history. Not because he was a warrior or a revolutionary, but because he was a builder, a planner, a quiet engineer of a democratic experiment that continues to evolve. Part 10. Retirement, Reflection, and a Fractured Union. After his final foray into presidential politics with the Free Soil Party in 1848, Martin Van Buren retreated to his estate, Lindenwold, nestled among the quiet hills of Kinderhook, New York. But retirement did not mean silence. He remained a keen observer of the nation's trajectory, penning letters to friends, former allies, and political thinkers, offering sober insights on the growing divides pulling America apart. Van Buren was now a man caught between eras. The political machine he had built was splintering under the pressure of moral and sectional crisis. The slavery debate, once skillfully sidestepped through compromise and party discipline, had grown into a firestorm that could no longer be contained by structure or moderation. The South and North were no longer speaking the same political language, and the national parties he once helped balance had fractured into bitterness, accusations, and soon violence. In a letter from 1860, Van Buren admitted he feared the very disunion he had worked his entire life to prevent. The secession crisis following Abraham Lincoln's election broke his heart. He had long hoped that structured party politics would channel conflict into conversation, not combat. But the storm was no longer theoretical. America was at war with itself. Part 11. Van Buren's Death and the Dawn of a New Age. Martin Van Buren died on July 24, 1862, at the age of 79. The Civil War had already begun. The Union, the country he had devoted his life to stabilizing, was soaked in blood. He did not live to see its end. At his funeral there were no grand parades or roaring crowds. His legacy was not heroic in the traditional sense. No battlefield named after him, no towering monument in the capital. Yet his contribution was just as foundational. He had invented the political party as a disciplined tool for democracy. He had elevated the voice of the common man in an era dominated by aristocrats. And he had dared, in the face of an entrenched establishment, to forge a new model of American politics, modern, organized, and relentless. Epilogue. The invisible architect of American democracy. Today, when Americans go to the polls, attend party conventions, or hear campaign operatives talk about swing states and voting blocs, they are unknowingly walking in Van Buren's footsteps. He wasn't the loudest, the boldest, or the most beloved president, but he was among the most consequential. His belief that political opposition must be organized, that democracy thrives through structured choice, and that every citizen, regardless of class, should have a voice, remains deeply embedded in the nation's DNA. Martin Van Buren, the sly, strategic, small-statured man from Kinderhook, didn't just serve as America's 8th president. He built the stage upon which all future American politics would play out. Clapperboard the end. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the life and legacy of Martin Van Buren, the founder of the Democratic Party and the invisible architect of American democracy, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. More incredible stories from history's hidden heroes are coming soon.